Ferrari. The disappointment and controversy over the championship, and the fractious relationships between both Prost and Mansell with the team and each other, shouldn't overshadow the fact that for the first time in a long while, a Ferrari driver was a genuine contender to win the driver's title. The 641 chassis handled like a dream, the 036 engine had bags of grunt, and the semi-automatic gearbox seemed to have shed its 1989 gremlins. Mansell, of course, had all the bad luck, and was deeply frustrated and demoralised, but even then he went into the last race with a chance of still taking third in the championship, if he'd won, which he came within a whisker of doing. Certainly qualifying performances were split evenly between the two. The question for 1991 is whether Ferrari can maintain their excellent form, and what the addition of Jean Alesi will bring to the team. Tyrrell Ford. Another great season for Tyrrell, though they never quite lived up to the early season promise of second places in Phoenix and Monaco. The new car certainly looked striking, but all sorts of unreliability issues prevented them from doing better than they did, with Alesi not scoring a single point after Monaco despite usually qualifying well. Part of the problem, if we're being honest, was in the cockpit. Alesi is clearly fast but remains erratic, often making silly mistakes that ended his race prematurely, while Nakajima underlined that he's a solid enough driver but without the chops to really succeed at this level. Next year with Honda engines and the talented Stefano Modena, though, will be interesting. Williams-Renault. A disappointing season for Williams, all told. The car seemed to have most of the elements in place to be great and was mostly reliable, but spent much of its time simply circulating in the lower points positions. The Renault V10 engine was a little down on power compared to the Honda or Ferrari, it's true, but even so there's a feeling around the paddock that, like Tyrrell, the problem was the drivers. Both perfectly competent, but neither had that star quality to get in there and mix it with the leaders. Great things were expected of Thierry Boutsen, but despite winning 3 races of the 4 Williams wins over his 2-year stint, consensus seems to be that he's blown his big chance. James Hunt's characterisation of him in Adelaide as a slow journeyman may be a little harsh, but there's always the suspicion that he was just never quite aggressive enough. Interestingly, Mansell tested the FW13B over the winter and got much better times out of it, and his input showed Patrick Head that the team had been a bit too conservative with their setups. So, Mansell and Patrese, and a new chassis designed by Adrian Newey for next year. Let's see how this goes. Brabham-Judd. After the ownership wrangles off-season, it was a minor miracle that Brabham made the grid at all in 1990, but a lack of money for development and a relative lack of power from the Judd engine combined to stymie any hopes they had of making their way back up the grid. Stefano Modena used the good Pirelli qualifying tyres to get good grid positions, but the race rubber just wasn't as good, and the car was just not quick enough despite being fairly reliable by the standards of a back-of-the-grid team. David Brabham looked all at sea, failing to qualify nearly half the time and only finishing once, but you can hardly blame him as the team just didn't have the resources to help him. With Modena on his way to Tyrrell for next year and a new Yamaha V12, it'll be all change again for the team. Arrows Ford. A classic example of how staying still is the same as going backwards in Formula 1. The A11 chassis debuted at the start of the 1989 season and did reasonably well for the team with Warwick and Cheever at the wheel, finishing on the podium in Phoenix and garnering 13 points overall for 7th place in the table. In 1990, the same car with the same engine managed just 1 points finish all year round and 7 DNQs. Both drivers are fairly highly rated, though there's an increasing feeling that Alboretto's a busted flush these days. Both drivers are still confirmed for next year, though, when the team will hope to benefit from a powerful new Porsche V12 in the back. Lotus Lamborghini. Nelson Piquet made the decision to leave Lotus, at least in part, as he believed the relatively underdeveloped Lamborghini V12 engine would be a liability rather than an asset to the team. He may well have been right, but the 102 chassis was also clearly just awful. It flexed all over the place, and even the ever-cheerful and brave Derek Warwick said later that he was scared to get in it. In the end, both he and Donnelly had incredible crashes that were fortunate not to be fatal, though possibly career-ending in Martin's case. It's certainly noticeable that the LaRousse Lola cars, with the same engine, had a much better season, at least in part by just being far more reliable. As the 1990 season closes, with no drivers, no engine and no sponsor signed up for next year, it's looking like this might be the end for the storied Team Lotus, who had their first win in the sport in October 1961, the 30th anniversary of which will happen between the Spanish and Japanese Grand Prix next year. Sentimentalists hope the team will be around to celebrate that, but there has seldom been much room for sentiment in this sport. Aella Ford. The little Aella team have somehow survived 11 years in Formula One without a great deal of success, and new shareholder Gabriele Rumi of the Fond Metal alloy wheels firm hasn't seen much more. One of the better teams in pre-qualifying at least, with a neat little chassis even if it was a year old, and early season gremlins aside, reasonably reliable. It finished twice as often as it didn't, even allowing for Guyar's somewhat erratic driving. There are suggestions that Rumi will buy out Enzo Aella over the winter and rename the team, so if this has been the last season of Aella Squadra Corse, then, well, it's been pretty much business as usual, to be honest. Leighton House Judd. Very much a season of two almost halves for the boys in Miami Blue. 6 DNQs in the first 6 races, including double DNQs in Brazil and Mexico. Then, the new B-Spec car was introduced in France with immediate effect, with Capelli second and Gugelmin unlucky not to finish behind him. But while it looked as if that was the start of the renaissance and qualifying performances did improve, there was only one more points finish, plus several 7th and 8th places, amid a welter of technical retirements. Ivan Capelli, a team shareholder, isn't going anywhere, and it would seem harsh to get rid of Gugelmin, who's not been notably worse, but with both drivers confirmed for a 3rd year, there's maybe a sense that new blood might be needed. One interesting development, though, might be that the team are due to switch from Judd power to a new V10 by the Mercedes-backed Ilmor firm. AGS Ford. Another plucky little team who have found the going rough. The introduction of the new JH25 chassis helped a little, but not a lot, and the team's dire financial straits meant that the car could never be upgraded, spares were thin on the ground, all of which affected reliability, and all the usual problems besetting the impecunious back-of-the-grid team. Nonetheless, despite not scoring a point as they did in 1989, Tarquini and Dalmas qualified more often overall, 9 times against 6 last year, and had 4 finishes against 3 last year, so if you want to look for positives, there they are. As always at this end of the grid, the team go into the winter just hoping to survive to start the next season. The talented Tarquini is on board if they do make it. Benetton Ford. The best year so far for the United Colours, finishing 3rd just as in 1988, only with 71 points and 2 wins, including the team's first 1-2, as opposed to 39 points from a clutch of 3rd places, as everyone was left with the MP44's table scraps 2 years ago. Nelson Piquet signed many of his critics, looking refreshed and revitalised after 2 miserable years at Lotus. He's always been a driver who needs a good car under him before he'll give his best, and a financial incentive per point probably didn't hurt either. Certainly if the rumours of $100,000 per point are true, he's cost Benetton a cool $4.4 million this year and scored every time he finished except at Monza. Nannini had all of the mechanical troubles and could still be a bit too aggressive, and could only manage 2/3 and a second as podium visits. If this is the last we've seen of Sandro in an F1 cockpit, it wasn't his best year, but he can at least look back with satisfaction on a good, if curtailed, career. We hope it isn't, of course, though it's unlikely he'll be back at least in the first half of 1991, so Benetton have a decision to make about their second driver. BMS Scuderia Italia Dallara Ford. Only 2 DNQs, but only 7 finishes tells its own story. The F190 was simply shockingly unreliable. Even the usually sturdy Ford DFV engine had a lot of failures because of the suspect electrical package, and even with De Cesaris's Marlboro money, the team simply didn't have the cash for spares, staff, or anything else to improve reliability. De Cesaris, who had of late been looking a much more solid mature driver, seemed to slip back into his De Crasherist days, presumably out of sheer frustration or boredom at simply circulating in midfield and waiting to break down, but Pirot also had his share of accidents too, so it's not entirely an Andrea problem. They will be taking on Judd engines next year and have confirmed Pirot, but the identity of the second driver is yet to be announced. Minardi Ford. A pretty dismal year for Giancarlo's boys, particularly disappointing after a good 1989 by their own admittedly modest standards. Whatever worked about the M189 just didn't seem to click with the M190, not helped by Pirelli's indifferent race rubber. though their qualifying tyres helped Pierluigi Martini to put in a series of great qualifying performances, often in the top half of the grid and quite often in the top 10, most famously the team's first front row start at Phoenix, tellingly in the old car. Paolo Barilla in the second car looked rather out of his depth. Being dropped by Minardi probably won't do his career prospects any good, but he still has all that pasta money and there are struggling teams out there. Ferrari engines for next year, though, could be a game changer, especially if they do sign up Ferrari test driver Gianni Morbidelli to give testing input. Ligier Ford. One step forward, one back for Ligier. The JS33 in 1989 failed to qualify 12 times, but scored points twice. Upgraded to B-Spec for 1990, the cars qualified for every race except one, and were incredibly reliable, but just not quick enough. Larini looked the better of the two drivers, but could do no better than a brace of back-to-back frustrating 7th places in Spain and Japan, while Alio was his usual self, nearly taking Mansell out at Jerez being the most high-profile example. Next year, the team have a proven race winner in Boutsen, a hot young talent in Eric Comas, Lamborghini engines, and hopefully a new chassis to put them all in. All change, and they'll hope it works, but 1991 will be a transition year anyway, as the team look forward to Renault power from 1992 and beyond. McLaren Honda. Another year, another title double, and just as last year, not one in the way anyone concerned would really want. There were signs in 1990 that McLaren's recent dominance was under threat too. The cars were fast in qualifying, but increasingly lost ground to the excellent Ferrari 641, which was noticeably better early in races while on a heavy fuel load. For the first time since the Williams domination of 1987, McLaren won less than half the races, just 6 of the 16, with Ferrari, Williams and Benetton all getting in on the action, and Ron Dennis might well feel that Gerhard Berger could have done better, though perhaps after the last couple of years he was just happy to have two drivers on speaking terms. More of the same for next year. The question is whether they can stay on top. Larousse Lola Lamborghini. If Gerard Larousse's team hadn't had problems with reliability, they might have done even better than they did, but 6 points finishes, 3 each for the two drivers, and one of them an honest-to-goodness podium, is still a pretty good haul for a team in their position. The LC90 chassis was efficient, and the Lamborghini engine continually improved as the season went on. Both drivers showed their quality, and the Japanese fans have really taken Aguri Suzuki to their hearts after his historic home podium. Both are on board for 1991, but with Lamborghini moving on, they've signed terms with Brian Hart to supply them with motors for next year. Colog Ford. Literally a season of two halves for Colog, which had 2 different entries. The first 8 races owned and powered by Subaru with the C3B chassis, and the second 8 races sold back to Enzo Coloni with Ford DFV power in a C3C chassis. And honestly, it didn't really make a lot of difference. The Subaru engine was a dead weight from the outset, something Giancarlo Minardi could probably have warned them about, since it was a rebadged version of the Motori Moderni Flat 12 they'd tested the previous year. And indeed the engine had been developed to use the Minardi gearbox, which didn't help when it was lifted up and plonked in the Coloni. At least when it had finally been replaced with the Ford DFR, Gasho made it through pre-qualifying more often than not, but every time he drove in main qualifying, he was the slowest car there, often by a fair margin. Gasho deserves better, and Enzo Coloni will be keen to draw a line under 1990 and see what next year brings, though with resources scarce, he's not got a lot to work with. Eurobrunn Judd. And so the Eurobrunn story comes to an end, with Stefano Modena 11th place in the 1988 Hungarian Grand Prix the highlight. Eyebrows were raised at the start of 1990 when, having run one single car in 1989 with 15 DNPQs and 1 DNQ on the results sheet, the team decided to expand to 2 cars again to accommodate Claudio Langes. And yet, even before the end of the 1989 season, it was obvious that Euro racing were all at sea, and Walter Brunn had somewhat lost interest, so doubling down on failure was a decidedly odd move. About the only saving grace for them in 1990 was that Roberto Moreno turned out to be rather good, but it's impossible to know if Langes was just not good enough, or if Moreno was flattering the car by actually dragging it into the race twice and finishing one of them. It seems harsh to say it, but Eurobrunn probably won't be missed on the F1 grid. Onyx Ford. And the Onyx story also comes to an end, and what a story it was. Some teams packed less drama into a decade than Onyx did in their 18 months or so in F1. It might make a good movie if it didn't have such a messy downbeat conclusion. It looked in 1989 as if the new team might do well, give Stefan Johansson a late career comeback, only for it to all to dissolve into court cases and mudslinging, a ridiculous attempt to move the team halfway across Europe in the middle of the season, a team co-owner buying a drive for his son. Gregor Wojtek never had the greatest reputation as a driver, and this really hasn't helped at all. Though to be fair to him, he matched his much more highly rated teammate Leto in qualifying and got the best result of the team's truncated season with 7th in Monaco after a combative drive. But JJ Leto really is the only man to come out of this whole affair without too much egg on his face, and he'll be hoping for better things in the future. Life, and Life Judd. Well, what can you say about possibly the most chaotic, disastrous and ill-prepared team the sport has seen in a long, long while? If even a new driver getting his first shot at F1 walks away after 2 races because the car can't even get out of the pit lane without breaking down, you know you're in trouble. The team allegedly didn't even own a tyre pressure gauge and had to borrow one from Eurobrunn. Life personnel have disputed that, but certainly it's on brand for them. The Life L190 was actually no faster than an F3 car, and perhaps that was its only saving grace. It never went fast enough for long enough to actually hurt anyone in the kind of accident that would otherwise have been inevitable. Still, it was nice to see Bruno Giacomelli's smiling face in the paddock once again, the popular Italian's grace being severely tested, but presumably accepting from the get-go that this was not the start of a big career comeback, but just an extended testing gig.